Welcome back to another episode of Principles of Microeconomics. Today we are still in Chapter 10, looking at monopolies. We learned last time how monopolies arise. A key condition was that there had to be barriers to entry. If there were no barriers, if the barriers were low, then new firms would start joining the market and competing with them, so monopoly would not last very long. Then we learned about how monopolies maximize profit. So, unlike the perfectly competitive firms, the rule price equals marginal cost doesn't work anymore. Instead, you use marginal revenue equals marginal cost to find the profit maximizing quantity. You then plot that on a demand curve to find the profit maximizing price, and that's how monopolies do their business. Now, more often than not, monopolies are a bad thing. We'll look at some of the problems with monopolies in this section. So the first problem is that monopolies tend to reduce total surplus in the market. Remember, we had consumer surplus and producer surplus that we learned about earlier. The demand curve gives the consumers willingness to pay, and the price is the amount that they actually pay. So if you value a good at $10, but the price is just $4, then you're $6 better off when you buy it. That's your consumer surplus. And likewise for producers, the gap between the price they'd be willing to accept, given by supply curve or marginal cost curve we learned about, and the price they actually receive. So if they have a marginal cost of $1 to make the good, but they sell it for $4, then they're $3 better off. So this over here is the competitive market outcome. As you can see, it's going to maximize the total of consumer surplus and producer surplus, therefore maximizing total surplus or social welfare. Now with monopolies, it's going to be a different story. So the competitive firm produces where price equals marginal cost. We can show it over here on this second diagram. So demand curve is shown here in green, and our marginal cost curve is in orange. So to perfect competition, you produce this quantity, so I call it QPC for perfect competition. You'd be charging this price over here. So that's the efficient outcome. That corresponds to this diagram. Monopolies, we said, follow a different rule. So the monopoly sets marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. This red line down here is the marginal revenue curve. Remember last time I asserted without proof that the marginal revenue curve has the same intercept as demand but double the slope. So that's going to be over here. So you find where marginal revenue intersects marginal cost. That's this point. That pins down the monopoly quantity. So I call that one QM for quantity monopoly. That's in contrast to QPC, quantity perfect competition. Now we identify the monopolist quantity, we're going to find the price. We look at where does that quantity fall on the demand curve, shown here in green, and this will be the price. So as you can see, the monopoly is producing less than perfect competition does. So their quantity is not going to be out here, it's going to be somewhere back around hereabouts. That's going to cut into total surplus, and that's going to reduce total welfare. So monopolies tend to produce quantities that are inefficiently low, and that's a bad thing. So there is some intuition behind this result. Remember, if you're in a perfectly competitive market, you're a price taker. That means you can't influence the price. You have to accept the market price as given. You can't change it. So when you're deciding about how much should you produce, you don't worry about your production influencing price because your production can't influence price. It's just not a factor in your decision. It's a different story for the monopolist. The monopolist can influence price, so a monopolist decides to produce more, they have enough clout that they actually can affect price. One thing that's going to concern a monopolist is that if they try to produce more, they're going to try to sell that good, they're going to lower prices. So that's a disincentive to produce extra. So that concern is going to apply to the monopolist, but not to the perfectly competitive firm. So that concern is going to cause the monopolist to produce less than the perfectly competitive firm would. That's why QPC, Q per competition, is bigger than Q monopoly. So by producing less, the monopolist can jack up the price. That's the idea. So you can see in the graph, I didn't draw a dashed line, but you can see if I did, the per competition price would be lower than monopolist price. So here's what it does to consumer and producer surplus. So here's a simplified diagram. Demand is here in blue, and marginal cost is here in green, and here is marginal revenue. So per competition you produce over here, marginal cost equals price. Monopolist produces where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and the terms of price is going to be up here on the demand curve. So under per competition you get this for consumer surplus and producer surplus. Total surplus is maximized. The monopolist, though, we said, is going to charge a higher price. So under per competition on this graph down here in the corner, the price will be over here. Because the monopolist charges a higher price, that's going to eat into consumer surplus. So unsurprisingly, consumers don't like monopolies. Monopolies are bad news for consumers and their welfare. You guys are probably acutely aware of this when you paid a lot of money for your textbook. Your consumer surplus went down because they charged a price that was really, really high. The higher price does, however, expand producer surplus. So if you had per competition, producer surplus would be down here, but now it's going to be bigger. Now, I can assert that producer surplus does unambiguously rise even though quantity has fallen. So you might have thought, if you have a higher price, a bigger height over here, smaller quantity, narrower width, that's going to have an ambiguous effect on producer surplus. That's actually not true. PS must go up. If it didn't, the monopolist would charge the perfectly competitive price, and they don't. So producer surplus does expand. Now, from the perspective of society, the expansion of producer surplus is not large enough to offset the loss in consumer surplus. So we have this red triangle here that is now no longer part of anybody's surplus. Back if you have per competition, that was partially consumer surplus, partially producer surplus, but now nobody gets that at all. That's because the monopolist produces a smaller quantity, so some transactions that just don't take place. So monopolists lead to deadweight loss and a reduction in social welfare. That's one big issue with monopolies and why typically monopolies are a bad thing. So this can be reconciled with a result we had earlier when looking at markets. We saw that big justification for free markets was the first fundamental welfare theorem. So the first fundamental welfare theorem said if we have these two conditions satisfied, then markets are efficient. Those conditions are you have a market for every good, and secondly, those markets are always perfectly competitive. So if you have a perfectly competitive market for everything, then your market's going to be efficient. Well, monopolies are not perfectly competitive. That's a violation of the first fundamental welfare theorem. So if that condition, per competition, does not apply, then the result, efficient markets, is not guaranteed to apply either. So that's one issue with monopolies. They violate the first fundamental welfare theorem and end up creating welfare losses through deadweight loss. Other issues that monopolies cause, so one is pretty obvious. You have fewer options for consumers, So in your case, you gotta buy the W. W. Norton textbook, or well, that's it actually. There is no other option. So fewer choices for consumers. That's going to also reduce their welfare. There's another issue that your book doesn't mention, but I think it's important. There is a reduction in incentives to innovate if you're a monopolist. If you are in a competitive industry, you've always got to try to find a way to do things better. If you don't, the firms you're competing with are going to be working on innovations. If they're innovating and you're not, you're going to be left behind. That's going to put you out of business. So it's this competitive pressure to try to keep innovating, keep finding ways to make things more efficient, keep finding ways to make better products, etc., that competitive firms face. Monopolists don't worry about that quite so much. If the monopolist fails to find a way to improve things, you still got to buy from them because they're a monopolist. No other choice. So less incentive to make progress for monopolists. So that can reduce long-run growth. Our next issue is something called rent seeking. So that means that the firm is using resources at a cost in order to influence the government. So here's how this creates losses for society. If the firm spends money lobbying the government, that doesn't help out the rest of us. That money could have been used instead for things that do advance society's goals. So the firm spent that money to research new innovations that could have helped out growth, that could have helped out the economy. Or the firm had spent money to invest in a new manufacturing plant that could have also helped out society through jobs and things like that. So that could have helped, but instead the money is spent lobbying the government. That is not helping anybody. So that's an inefficiency. So one extreme case, if you might see some countries where corruption is the norm, a government might, sorry, not the government, the firm might bribe the government in order to retain, in order to get monopoly privileges. So it might be the case you need a license from the government to operate in a certain industry. That the firm pays a bribe, only they get the license, and every other competitor who wants to compete gets denied. So that creates monopolies and creates welfare losses. Now, just because your country is not corrupt does not mean that you don't have rent seeking. There's definitely an issue of rent seeking here in America, which is a country that is low in corruption. So firms might influence the government to try to increase barriers to trade, for example. That can reduce competition and strengthen the firm's monopoly status, or make it closer to a monopoly if it's not a monopoly already. Or firms can lobby for favors like tax credits or things like that, or regulations that harm their competitors that would reduce overall economic efficiency. That's another problem with monopolies. So while monopolies are usually a bad thing, it's not always the case. We talked a little bit earlier about some of the possible benefits from monopolies. Let's try to go through that in more detail, though. Again, more often than not, monopolies are not great for the economy. So one issue we talked about earlier was that some industries, by their very nature, have very large fixed costs. We talked about developing drugs. We also talked about musicians creating new music. In those cases, the fixed cost is very, very high. The marginal cost can be quite low. So with drugs, you might spend $1 billion to create a new drug or a new vaccine or something like that. The marginal cost, though, is the cost of that last bottle of pills. That's going to be really tiny, and that's going to make it difficult or impossible to recover your fixed cost. Likewise with music, it takes a lot of time and effort to write a good song, but then if you charge the price to the cost of downloading a song is going to be very, very small, and the songwriter gets almost nothing for all their effort. That's a disincentive to create music in the first place. So here's an illustration with a graph. I designed this example to have a really large fixed cost of 500. So it's going to have very high average total cost overall. So if you have perfect competition, you set price equal to marginal cost. Price comes from the demand curve. Demand curve is shown here in green. So that's this one, the graph. Marginal cost curve is shown in orange. That's this upward sloping line. So price equals marginal cost means you charge a price that's going to be down here, this black dot. As you can see, that price is below the average total cost curve. ATC here is shown in blue. So price is your average revenue per unit. ATC is average cost per unit. The perfectly competitive firm is not bringing in enough revenue to pay for that cost. So in a perfect competition, the firm make a loss. You might be able to survive that in the short run, but long term, this is not sustainable. In particular, the firm knew in advance there's probably going to be losses, then they're not going to bother researching a new drug in the first place. So in a perfect competition, the drug company would not do this in the first place, and that would be bad for society because then we would not get new medicines, we would not get any advances in healthcare. Now, a monopolist is going to do something different. We know the monopolist charges where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Or I shouldn't say charges, they produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So marginal revenue is shown here in red. So remember I said earlier, marginal revenue is the same intercept as demand, but double the slope. So this is the marginal revenue curve. The marginal cost curve is still the orange line, so they cross over at this point down here. So we know quantity is going to be at this point. We find the price by plotting that on a demand curve. That's going to be up here. So a price of looks like about 60. So while a perfectly competitive firm was unprofitable, the monopolist is profitable. Their price is around here at 60. That's average revenue per unit. Their average cost is going to be down here. That's going to be where the blue line ATC crosses that quantity. So price is above average cost. The monopolist can make a profit, so now the monopolist does have an incentive to research and create the new drug, and that new drug can make life better for people and help out society by improving healthcare. So the monopolist strengthens incentives that the perfectly competitive firm would not have, and that can be welfare enhancing if you have a large fixed cost. So that's one possible benefit of a monopoly, even though typically monopolies are a bad thing. This is an exception. Benefit number 2. Your book does not mention this, but it's an important point to be aware of. We talked about externalities earlier back in Chapter 7. Remember, an externality is some cost or benefit that is borne by a third party, and that cost or benefit is received outside the market. The classic example was pollution. Pollution affects the welfare of other people. However, there is no market for pollution. That's going to fit our definition of an externality very, very cleanly. We demonstrated in Chapter 7 that if you have a negative externality like pollution, something that's going to harm people, then competitive markets are going to overproduce. The intuition? The competitive market considers their own costs and their own benefits. What they disregard are society's benefits and society's costs. So S internal is given by the firm's own marginal costs. If they were to account for the extra costs they most of society, the cost through pollution, supply would be over here at S social. But the firm doesn't do that. They also look at their own costs, their own benefits. They care about this supply curve, S internal. So what they do, they charge a price over here, P market, and they produce a quantity shown down here, Q market. What that does is it results in a quantity and a price, a quantity that's going to be inefficiently high, and a price that's going to be inefficiently low. So for those last units over here, consumers were willing to pay this much, that's what's given by their demand curve for those last units, the marginal cost to society to make those units is going to be up here. That's given by S social. So for those last units, the cost to society exceeded the benefit to consumers. So making those last units was not a good idea. That's reducing overall social welfare. That creates this deadweight loss triangle over here. So perfectly competitive markets were not very good in handling pollution. They produce too much. Well, monopolies are different. If a perfectly competitive market produces too much pollution, too much production, I should say, perfectly competitive market produces too much, and a monopolist produces too little, that can cancel out, and a monopolist might actually be efficient. The efficient outcome here involves charging a higher price, producing a lower quantity, and that is precisely what monopolists do. So monopolists can actually reduce social losses from pollution. Monopolists might actually be efficient if you consider the pollution aspect. So you might be surprised to hear this, but monopolists could actually be a good thing for the environment. So a couple other possible benefits from monopolies. So again, good monopolies are the exception rather than the rule, but there are some benefits, so let's be aware of those exceptions. One issue is that the potential of becoming a monopoly might incentivize firms to innovate. So what they might be tempted to do is break up monopolies into smaller firms. We'll look at that as being one solution to a monopoly. However, that might weaken incentives for competition and for innovation. If you're always going to break up monopolies, what you're effectively saying is that firms can compete, but nobody's allowed to win. If you're not allowed to win the competition, then there's not a lot of incentives to do your best and really give your maximum effort at trying to innovate and make things better for consumers. So you have to have competition to create some incentives to innovate, but you gotta sometimes allow a firm to win to show them that there are benefits to if they keep innovating and keep trying to find ways to make things better. There's a balance to strike there, and it's tricky to find what that proper balance is. So that's another possible benefit from monopolies. There's going to be a right amount or even an efficient amount of monopolies to allow. Another benefit we saw was that if you have economies of scale, you can get lower total costs. We saw this way earlier in part 1. So let's just go back to that diagram briefly. That was way back over here. So remember, economies of scale mean your long-run average total costs go down when you produce more. So in that case, if you have one big firm producing everything, that's going to mean low cost overall. Having a bunch of small firms producing small amounts is going to mean higher costs overall. So it's actually more efficient to have just one big firm be a monopoly and have the lowest costs if you have economies of scale. So not every industry has economies of scale. This is peculiar to a couple industries like electricity generation, for example. So in some limited cases, economies of scale apply and allowing monopolies can be efficient. Where was I? We were over here. So that wraps up our section on problems with monopolies. So monopolies do have some benefits. They're not always bad, but typically they're a bad thing, and we want to look at some policy solutions to deal with them. So this wraps up part 3. Please come back for episode 4, and we'll learn more about solutions to monopolies.